Welcome everyone to a new webinar series for us on building effective boards of directors. And we've got Dr. Steven Hoffman here with us, the coordinator of the Historic Preservation Program at Southeast Missouri State University, longtime board member of Old Town Cape, which is the Main Street program in Cape Girardeau. And also on our board of directors of Missouri Main Street has been past president currently for us. And he's going to share wisdom about effective board of directors in your local Main Street program. So Stephen, I'm going to turn over to you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Keith. And thank you all for attending this webinar. And what we want to talk about today is steps to success, building an effective board of directors. The agenda that I have is really to kind of talk about some key characteristics for a truly effective board. I'm going to focus a lot on the relationship between the executive director and the board chair and the executive committee, really more broadly thinking about the leadership team. And so whether you have an executive director or not, you certainly have a leadership team. And so I'm going to be focusing on some aspects of that and the relationships that really help for making a truly effective board. Also want to talk about the ways in which it's important for the board to be reflective of the community in which your organization is located. And then lastly, I want to talk about succession planning and really sort of thinking about the future of the organization and how to prepare yourself to be a truly sustainable board for the long term, because again, that's another characteristic of being an effective board. I'll also toss in a bonus slide at the end, and we'll just kind of take it from there. So first off, effective boards have effective leadership teams. And the idea here is that you're really looking for a partnership. And so, as Keith mentioned, I was president of Missouri Main Street Board and worked very closely and collaboratively with our executive director, Gayla Roten. And so, first and foremost, this relationship needs to be collaborative. It needs to be supportive. It needs to be grounded in a relationship of trust. When you think about the leadership team, the sort of the key leaders and their relationship is important. But I also want to talk a little bit about executive committees, because they can really help share the load and shape what what the organization is able to do and increase its effectiveness moving forward. In a few minutes, I'm going to talk about leadership styles, but just to kind of preview that discussion a little bit, I really want to emphasize the importance of having a coaching leadership style, particularly among the executive team, because this is kind of a style where everyone is working to bring out the best in the people around them. And so really in that relationship between a board chair and an executive director, or among the executive committee, it's really essential that everyone helps each other be the best that they can be with the responsibilities that they have. It's really important in thinking about those responsibilities that that the executive director and the board chair have different roles and responsibilities. And we often talk about this as being the difference between governance and management. And so in terms of thinking about these roles, and it's pretty clear when you're in an organization that has a board chair, and executive director. If you don't have an executive director, then really you still have these roles and responsibilities. It just means that you have multiple people who are performing the duties of the director, but you still want to have a sense of what's governance, what's management, and what's appropriate for each person to be engaged with. And so kind of a close up on this chart, which is from Board Source, you can see that the board's responsibility is really about governance, right? So the board chair and the board lead on governance, and then the executive director has a different domain of leadership, and really they lead on management and execution. And so it's really important that both of these people, or both of kind of these sets of responsibilities, the people in charge of them, support each other. But it's important to keep in mind that supporting is not doing. And so looking at the middle of this slide where the shared tasks are, that is where the magic happens, right? Where the governing elements of it and the management execution elements of it come together. And so for that to be as effective as it possibly can be, you really need to have clear and trusted communication at that level. Now, this is a slide that I have borrowed from the Washington Main Street program. And I really like it because it shows how the interaction between board and staff and volunteers and the mission of the organization, how they're all interconnected and related. And so when you think about the mission as a whole, I think it becomes clear that some of the tasks that are needed to accomplish this are governance, and some of those tasks are management. And so the most successful organizations are going to have clarity about those differences. And when the board or the board chair get involved in management, they become micromanagers. And no executive director likes that. It's important to know that we are all headed in the same direction. And it's critical that we support each other in getting there. But we also need to recognize that we all have our own lanes. And so, as board members, it's important that you stay in your lane. And that said, um, one of your responsibilities is to support the execution of whatever the projects or policies that the board has decided upon. And in order to do that effectively and in a supportive way, it really is built on the relationships that the members of the team, the staff, the board, the volunteers, it really depends on those relationships. I think one of the things that we learn in Main Street is that everything is about relationships. And so, in thinking about the building blocks of positive relationships that result in finely executed projects, I think that communication, collaboration, and trust are really essential. Thinking about communication, here, there are different elements of communication that are important. Communication skills are fundamental to the building of positive and solid relationships. The board chair's communication with the executive director, with staff, with the board, with communities, is really important. Communicating with the board is a peer-to-peer in peer-to-peer communication. Communicating, with the community is as a volunteer, right, and as somebody who's giving to the community, and so. as we think about our roles on the board, it's important to realize that everyone on the board is a leader. And the committee chairs are also leaders. And so being able to be effective communicators is really essential for this leadership team in its entirety. Interpersonal communication skills are important as well. Serving on the board, you will often find yourself in a mediating role. We seek to be collaborative with the stakeholders and the interests and the kind of the broad range of people and entities in our community. And so as we try to collaborate and hear all voices and bring everything to the table, being able to be in that mediating role with strong interpersonal skills is really important. And so thinking about developing those or identifying the people on the board who have really good interpersonal communication skills, that this is something that that emphasizing that is going to help your board be more effective. The public speaking piece of the communication skills aspect has to do with communicating the mission and vision of the organization to the larger community and to various stakeholders. So effective and clear communication amongst all these entities is really essential. It's important that it be clear. It's important that it take place in an environment of trust so that the organization can be as effective as it possibly can. Earlier, I mentioned that we would talk about leadership styles. And if you know, whenever you talk about leadership styles, you hear there are all these different kinds of leadership styles. And sometimes the advice is to like figure out what your style is and you know, and kind of lean into that. But basically, I'm here to tell you that it doesn't matter what your personal leadership style is, because it's not really about you. It's about what's good for the organization. And what that means is that you need to be a coach, at least in terms of your relationship with the executive director. But I would argue in all of your relationships within the organization. This is something that as I mentioned before, this coaching leadership style is one where you are able to help others become the best that they can be. I know that sounds like a cliche, but really it's about empowering others, finding what people do best and helping them do that. And regardless of where you are in the organization, you are a leader and you should use your time on the board um, uh, in this in this coaching mode, right? Where you are using your interactions to help get to the best result. And that means listening to others, bringing them on board, really helping them be better, you know, helping the executive director be better. Um, and we'll talk in a minute, that's often not telling them what to do to be better, right? But it's a way of relating to and engaging with people that involves listening and supporting. There have been studies about what makes an effective board chair, and I realize not everybody in this webinar is in the role of a board chair, but I think you want to think of yourself as someone who is um, you know, is a future board chair if you're not a current board chair. And so some of these qualities and some of this information I think are relevant for you, no matter what position you occupy. What makes an effective board chair is based on a study by Nonprofit Quarterly that looked at what the best and worst board chair characteristics were. And if you look at this list, and we're not going to read all of this, but relationship competencies. We've been talking about that in terms of the communication and in developing relationships with good communication skills. But this idea of being flexible and comfortable with people, listening, right? Those are very positive qualities. Commitment and action competencies, right? Actually doing something and leading by example. Some of these other competencies are areas that Nonprofit Quarterly highlighted as being important characteristics for good board chairs. The bad characteristics are dictatorial and domineering, or someone with a self-serving agenda. And I think that we can recognize that those qualities are unhelpful among any board member, whether they're a board chair or not. And thinking about sort of these qualities and bringing them to the fore and helping each other develop them more fully for the good of the organization, it's important to keep in mind kind of the three groups that board chairs and board members have influence on. First and foremost, they influence other board members, right? It's this peer-to-peer relationship. But board chairs and board members also influence CEOs and executive directors of other organizations, right? Because in a way that staff don't necessarily have that kind of influence, right? Because they're being paid to do a job. But as a board member, you are volunteering in that role, and you bring a status and a stature that allows you to influence these other executives in the community. And then along those same lines, the third group are the external stakeholders and the funders. And again, staff has relationships with them, but it's the board and the board chair that can have the most influence because it's this peer-to-peer relationship. And so this is the area in terms of external stakeholders and funders, that an effective leadership team that has really collaborative, strong communication and environment of trust between the governance and the management sides of the overall endeavor, when that is functioning well, this is the kind of thing that can take the organization to the next level. So a couple of closing words on sort of coaching do's and don'ts, because I've been trying to emphasize that. And I know personally, when somebody comes to me with a problem, my first reaction is to offer a solution. And you may or may not be like me, but I'm going to make an assumption that you are volunteering for a Main Street organization. You are in a leadership role, or else you wouldn't be listening to this webinar. And so, you're pretty smart and you've got some great ideas. And when somebody comes to you with a problem, the immediate thought is, hey, I can help them solve this. But that's not a coaching response, right? A coaching response is really to listen carefully, to be thoughtful in how you respond, and really what you're trying to do is help the other person work their way to a solution, and to refrain from imposing your own solution, because a lot of times that's not why people are wanting to talk with you, right? That they're not, oh, I need a shortcut, do my job for me. It really is just looking for a sounding board, looking for some additional perspectives. And so by providing that in this kind of leadership style, you're helping um, uh, the the um, the executive director or other board members. You're helping them really, be the best that they can be in that moment. And if we're all on the same page doing that, our organization is going to be awesome and amazing. So in terms of executive committees can be really helpful for a variety of reasons. They can be particularly helpful if you have a large board. Um, they could be helpful. They're a really good place to process difficult topics or to provide support and direction to the executive director. Again, as we've just been talking about, kind of a brainstorming, sounding board kind of forum, right, that you may not want to do with the board as a whole, but is more comfortable and more productive in a smaller, more close-knit meeting. And then lastly, in terms of um, uh, executive committees can often respond more quickly than the board as a whole. And so you want to be careful that you're not um, dealing with matters that need to be addressed by the board as a whole. But a lot of times it really is a question that we know the direction of the board, and in keeping with the mission, it really is just a way for the executive director to kind of vet the idea with others, but to do it in a more timely fashion. And so executive committees can be really essential for that. Thinking about our role on the board, it's important to keep in mind that on the one hand, yes, we have these governance responsibilities on the board. We probably, since we're all working boards, we have, some of the execution, piece of it as well. But in a lot of ways, one of the key roles that we play is as a voice for the organization. And it's important as this voice that we really um, are positive in how we present ourselves and how we present the work of the organization. In essence, we are cheerleaders, we are ambassadors. And so if you have discussions at the board level, and you want in those discussions to have a wide variety of input, right? A wide variety of opinions from the range and variety of people that you have on the board, and so there may be some disagreements. And on the board, you kind of work through that and you come up with the best solution. And once the board makes a decision, it's important that everybody on the board get behind that. That you don't want to take disagreements that you've had in the boardroom out to the community as a whole, because it's important to project in a positive way the work of the organization. And so despite what else you might be doing for the board and for the organization, it's important to keep in mind that at all times you are a representative, an ambassador, and a cheerleader, and to have that aura of positivity about it. The other arena that I wanted to talk about has to do with board composition. And it's really important that your board reflect the community in which you're located, and for you to be thoughtful and reflective about what that means. And so why is it important that boards are representative of their communities? There are a variety of reasons. One of which, the low-hanging fruit, I guess, is that It's part of the accreditation criteria, right? And so this is something that Missouri Main Street is going to be looking at in the future. I think that, we can, think philosophically about issues of equity and justice, and that if we're a community organization, it is only right that we include everybody in our community in that. But there are just some practical reasons as well. If an organization has roots throughout the community, then the foundation of that organization is going to be anchored at all points and not just in some. And so it can withstand whatever wins or challenges might come its way. The more diverse and representative your board is, the more resources you have to draw on. You can kind of think of it as a sort of relationship wealth, right? That we mentioned before, everything's about relationships. The more representative your board is, the more relationships you have with more sectors of your community. And that's a kind of wealth that can be very useful for the overall success of the organization. Research shows that diverse boards make better decisions. There was a 2019 McKinsey and Company study that showed that companies in the top 25% for gender diversity in their leadership teams had above average earnings when compared to less diverse companies. So it just makes sense. The more voices you have at the table, the more representative those views are, the better the quality of the decisions are going to be, and the better the performance of the organization. So how do we think about being inclusive or being more inclusive of the diversity that is reflected in our community? Really, it all starts with just having a discussion, just kind of opening up this like, hey, are we reflective of the demographics in our community? And to do an assessment of the board, right? To look at that question honestly and say, like, who are we? And of all the boxes that could be ticked in our community, how many of them are we ticking? Um, uh, in that discussion, it's important to understand this concept of implicit bias. These are the biases that we all have. In my day job, I'm coordinator of the Historic Preservation Program here at Southeast Missouri State University. I get to work with a lot of really talented and wonderful young people. And I can't tell you how many times I have heard people say, young people today, they fill in the blank. They don't work as hard. My colleagues will tell you that they don't read nearly as much as they used to, that they can't write as well. I think that, we all are familiar with those voices out there talking about, the youth of today. Um, and and yet I can tell you, I work with some amazing young people who do not fit those stereotypes at all. And it's not just them, right? One of the things that I think most of us have heard is that like old people aren't very good with technology, right? And like, oh, I've got to talk to my grandchildren to program the VCR. Not that anybody uses a VCR anymore, right? But those kinds of statements are out there. And yet I think we all know um, people who are not young anymore, but who are embracing of technology and know a lot about it. So we all have this implicit bias about different groups of people, and we're not going to change that. But what we want to do is be aware of it, right? And say, oh, as we look at our current board and we see the need, I don't know, for young people, right? Let's keep in mind, not all young people today are lazy or don't know how to read or aren't respectful or whatever that, right? We want to set that aside and evaluate people on their individual characteristics and not on any preconceived notions about them. It's important to be intentional, right? And to recruit for skills, but with a diversity inclusion mindset, right? So nobody wants to say or hear like, oh, we need a woman on our board and you're a woman, like, will you join our board? It's like, no. Or gosh, we really need the youth and you seem to be young, join our board. You don't want to do that, right? But if, say, you are thinking, you do this assessment and you think, gosh, it would be really good to have a banker, or it would be really good to have an accountant on our board. And then you can think, okay, well, we don't have any young people, or we don't have any women. Do we know any women bankers? Do we know any younger bankers? Um, it really is just to think about where um, where gaps in your makeup as it relates to your community might exist, and being intentional about trying to address those. The good news is Missouri Main Street can help. They've got great materials to help think about who you are as a community, what your age, demographic background is, to think about the different kinds of skills and experience that you need, right? Because you need diversity of experience if your organization is going to be effective. You need diversity of perspective and profession and age and gender and all of those things. Whatever it is that your community is, you want to have roots into as many of those sectors as possible so that you are firmly grounded in your community and that you can do the work that your community needs done. Something else to think about in terms of effective boards is having a succession plan. To think about this idea of what happens if the executive director leaves. What happens if a key volunteer leaves? What happens when you leave? And I know most of us don't really want to think about this, right? But chances are we're not going to be with this organization forever. And so we want to make sure that there's a plan in place to continue to bring new leadership into the organization. Sometimes there are unexpected challenges that come from the outside, and um, and we as a board have to respond to that. But sometimes they come from inside the organization. And here, having a good succession plan can help us do that. Now, there are different types of succession plans. There's emergency succession planning, right? This is when the executive director departs suddenly and unexpectedly, and it's like, okay, now what do we do? Um, there's a departure defined succession planning, which is in some ways similar to, B is similar to A, right? In that the executive director is leaving, but since you have more time, it allows for a more thoughtful transition. But some of the questions that you want to think about and that succession planning can help you think about in advance um, have to do with who has responsibility for what. So if the executive director leaves, who's responsible for communication with the community? Right? And so identifying that person or that position in the organization will make it easier to respond when and if something like this occurs. You need to think about, well, what are the tasks that we're going to have to accomplish if we have an executive director transition? And so part of that is going to be searching for a replacement, right? So who's going to be taking the lead on that? What's that going to look like? Something that is really important and is often overlooked is who's going to be responsible for sustaining existing relationships. Um, what are those relationships? Who are they with? Why are they important? That's all information that is often contained in people's heads. And so as leadership changes, a lot of times that gets lost. I've had personal experience here in Cape Girardeau where we had a leadership change, and um, we had an individual in the community who was a major donor and sponsor of Christmas. And um, and the new executive director didn't know that and was out working with sponsorships, and I'm going to say inadvertently gave the top Christmas sponsorship to someone else. And so and it wasn't this director's fault. They had no idea of this pre-existing important relationship. And so we had a lot of fence mending to do. And that was because we dropped the ball on sustaining this existing relationship in a way that information transferred fully to the new executive director. So, but these are things you can think about in advance and you can plan for, so that um, that that whoever steps into that space has the information they need to keep the organization moving forward, and not having it inadvertently have a step backward. In terms of C, the strategic leader development, this is really thinking about being intentional about having an ongoing process for developing leaders within the organization. What are you going to do to grow and develop your own leaders? This is this is how you develop depth on your bench. It can be a critical part of responding to whatever crisis presents itself. It could be part of the succession plan about you and your role in the organization and who's going to come up behind you to take on the roles that you leave behind, whether because you're leaving the organization or because you're moving up into new roles, right? For your organization to continue to have sustained progress for years to come, we need to be bringing in the tomorrow's leaders today. And so this is something that you can think about. What's your plan for creating the succession plan for key volunteers in your organization? So those are really the sort of the key or some of the key characteristics of creating a really effective board of directors. At the beginning, I promised I would throw in a bonus slide. And really it's a bonus slide because I'm not sure that these are key characteristics for like steps to success of becoming an effective board of directors. I think they're more what effective boards of directors are able to do. And that is, you should be thinking about creating an operating reserve, and you should think about creating emergency and disaster plans. In terms of an operating reserve, you really want to be thinking of, 3 to 6 months, maybe a year's worth of reserves for your organization. Probably not more than 2 years, and certainly not less than one pay. Now, if you're a new organization, particularly one that doesn't have an executive director yet, I know you're thinking, oh my gosh, how are we going to find the money to pay for staff, let alone have a reserve in place? And I realize it could be a kind of a big, a big pill to swallow, or a big too big of a bite to bite off. But successful organizations have reserves, and you need to be keeping that in the back of your mind as something that you want to develop, because you never know what the future is going to bring. If you have a major fundraiser, it could be weather dependent. And if it doesn't come in at what you're expecting, what are you going to do? How are you going to make up that difference? Or, as we've all discovered, none of us thought we would live through, a global pandemic. But, we found ourselves in the middle of a global pandemic, and how are we going to respond? What happens if you are successful, having the city become the kind of investor that they really need to be in your organization, and then the political winds change and boom, that funding disappears. Well, if you have an operating reserve, that buys you the time to kind of weather this change. So I think it's really an outcome of an effective board, and it's something that you should be working toward. In terms of emergency and disaster plans, this is something where it might not be top on your agenda to do, but it is something that you should be thinking about, because this is an area where you can really help your community. And it's the kind of thing that, like, nobody really expects the flood to come or the tornado to come, or the buildings to collapse, or a major fire to happen, or any of the numerous kinds of disasters that we've seen happen to communities across the country. But as as a Main Street organization, you are in a position where you are the connector and the facilitator, and you can be the go-to person for the property owners and the businesses and the residents and the city government. And you have the professional capacity and resources and networks to really help in the response mode. And so when you are having a board and an organization that is firing on all of its cylinders, this is something that you really should take on. I think it is evidence of a community with a really very effective board. Now, you may not want to go to the trouble of having a zombie response team like in Wenatchee, Washington, right? That may be, a step down the road, but having a sense of a of developing some emergency disaster plans can be really helpful. There are resources out there. The National Main Street Center is developing a disaster preparedness and resilience toolkit. It was supposed to be out. It's been delayed. I don't know what the status is, but I do know that there are resources that National has and that Missouri Main Street can connect you with to help you think about what you need to do to have an effective emergency or disaster plan. And so really that brings us to the end of this webinar. The keys to having an effective board are really having that collaborative leadership team that is based on trust and collaboration and communication, and is truly supportive. It's being representative of the demographics of your community, and making sure that you represent the community as a community organization, and then having a succession plan so that when leadership changes occur, whether with staff or with the board or with other key volunteers, that you know what to do and have a plan to move forward. So, so thank you. Thank you for being a leader in your community. We can't wait to see what you do next. And please feel free to reach out to me or the Missouri Main Street leadership team if you'd like to discuss in more detail anything that I have presented here today. So thank you.